The Friday box office numbers are not officially out yet, but at this very early stage, things are looking very bad for Dark Phoenix. Part of the problem that faces Dark Phoenix is the access media hasn't afforded it the same type of protection that they gave to Captain Marvel. If we take a look at Rotten Tomatoes, which was ground zero for the whole Captain Marvel protection racket, we can see that Dark Phoenix right now has 23% from the critics and 64% from the audience score, and these are the verified audiences. You're no longer allowed to put a review into Rotten Tomatoes anymore. And for Captain Marvel, they have 78% from the critics and 55% for the audience. And that 55% is after all of the deletions and all of the shenanigans they went through to try to prop it up as high as possible to try to protect the film. Now, they tried to pretend that they weren't protecting the film, obviously, but then if people were a bit more honest, they were saying they were protecting the film because it had a female star in it. And you can't criticize a film for a female star, or in particular here they were saying it was the first superhero female, and then obviously it was pointed out that there were quite a few superhero females before Captain Marvel. And then it was the first Marvel film with a female superhero. I think Elektra is the name of the other one that had a female starring in it. No, it's an MCU film. This is the first MCU film for female in it, and that's why the film had to be protected. Well, here we've got the first X-Men film headlined by a female. Okay, Dark Phoenix, got Sophie Turner here. No similar protection at all, so it's got nothing to do with there being a female in charge of these roles that haven't had a female in front before, and she's definitely starring in the movie, and she is prominent in all of the marketing material. She's got a much bigger picture compared to all the other people. She is the star of the movie. She is the Dark Phoenix. It is called Dark Phoenix. So the real difference between the two films is not that they both are starring females in a superhero film, but Brie Larson was an outspoken critic of white dudes over 40, which is a very politically correct position to have. You can criticize white people or white men over 40 as much as you like, and that is celebrated by a certain class of people. While Sophie Turner, she certainly hasn't said anything like that I've seen, and she also had some statements about the pay gap that didn't really go with the politically correct opinion, which is obviously females get paid less money than men because they're females, and there's no other reason behind it. That's the myth of the pay gap. She was asked about Game of Thrones, how come she gets paid less money than some of the male stars, and she just said something on the lines of, well, that's just what she gets paid. She didn't have a good politically correct answer at the time. I bet she will now. I bet she'll be coached on what she has to say to do a bit of virtue signaling, but at the time, a little bit of an honest answer from her. It's just how much money she was getting paid. And without this level of protection that Captain Marvel got compared to Dark Phoenix, what you've got is you've got two films that are fairly similar, I'd say, in their quality. Okay, I personally think Dark Phoenix was a bit better than Captain Marvel, but not a lot better. Okay, I thought Captain Marvel was a bit meh, and I would say Dark Phoenix is a bit meh. They both weren't terrible. The production quality of both films were fine. There was nothing really outstandingly good in either of the films, okay? So I didn't think that Captain Marvel was absolutely atrocious, as a lot of people said. I certainly disagree that if people are saying it was the best film ever, that's what a lot of people are saying. I had a lot of criticism against idiots that were saying Captain Marvel is the best film ever. I can't believe how good it is. It's not good. Captain Marvel is not a good film, and anyone says it's a good film, I think they're lying for a political reason. Dark Phoenix isn't really that good a film either. I might stretch it a little bit to say, yeah, it was good as an X-Men film, and again, I think the Dark Phoenix was a little bit better than Captain Marvel, but we're not dealing with sort of things that I think that are that much apart, really. But the actual critics have said 23% versus 78%, which I think is a ridiculous gap. There is no way that Dark Phoenix is that much worse compared to Captain Marvel. And I'm obviously not the only person that thinks that. We can just see the audience review scores here on Rotten Tomatoes. 64% for Dark Phoenix, 55% for Captain Marvel. I think the 64% is just a little bit higher than I would personally put Dark Phoenix. 55% for Captain Marvel. Probably a little bit high again for what I think, but I don't really have a big problem if someone said 55%. The film was a bit meh. Dark Phoenix, I'd say, is a bit better than just meh, but okay, they're sort of middle of the road, somewhat similar. But if we compare the audience percentages to the actual critics' percentages, that's what just sticks out like a sore thumb here. We got 23% for critics for Dark Phoenix versus 64 audience, 78 for Captain Marvel versus 55. So the audiences think they're both kind of middle of the road. Dark Phoenix is a little bit better than that, but the critics completely different scores for, again, I think somewhat similar films. They're superhero films that weren't fantastic. Okay, they weren't terrible, they weren't fantastic. 23% for one, 78% for the other one. Seems a little bit crazy to me. And although personally I don't put much stock in the Critic's percentages, that's the percentage that a lot of people will quote, and that's the percentage you see if you buy tickets from a lot of online vendors. So if you go to a lot of different places online to buy tickets, they'll actually show a Rotten Tomatoes score next to it, and the score you see is that Critic score. So you'll see 23% listed next to stuff for Dark Phoenix. You won't really see the audience score very easily. And also, when you see articles talking about the Rotten Tomatoes score, they're headlining this 23% right now, saying what a bad score it's got. And so, although I don't think it's an important score to look at, I prefer to look at the audience score. That is the actual score that a lot of places are quoting, a lot of places look at. And it is still fairly important. As much as I don't like Rotten Tomatoes, it is still a place that's quoted by a lot of other places that are then looked at by people. So the 23% is very important compared to the 78%. And it's obviously going to hurt in its opening weekend. So, how is the weekend shaping up for Dark Phoenix? How bad is it? Well, a couple of days ago, Deadline had this article here, and they were saying they predicted about a $50 to $55 million opening weekend. But we have an article here from Deadline from Friday, which says they're now predicting a $15 to $16 million Friday, which includes $5 million from Thursday's previews. And the current weekend total is looking at $36.5 million, an absolutely catastrophic number. $36.5 million opening weekend probably means Dark Phoenix is going to lose a whole pile of money. When we take a look at Box Office Mojo to see where that places the film, about a $36.5 million opening weekend, it's around about number 400. So it'll be the 400th biggest opening ever, not really groundbreaking sort of material, but that's where it places it. So a very disappointing amount of money for an X-Men movie. It has a reported budget right now of $200 million. Now, you never really get to see what the real total is, but that's the number being thrown around by a few different sources right now. So a $36 million open with a $200 million budget, that's absolutely catastrophic, and this will probably be a big loss maker for Disney. So Disney didn't really have anything to do with making the film, but they own the film now. They bought Fox, or they bought the entertainment part of Fox, not Fox News, and so they're going to have to wear this. So I imagine they were probably going to recast everyone and reboot it anyway, but I think this will seal the fate of the actual actors themselves. So I can't imagine with this kind of spectacular fail, and again, Friday numbers aren't out yet, so maybe this won't happen, but it does look like this is going to fail spectacularly. So imagine that they're just going to redo X-Men. X-Men will be redone, and there's no reason to pick up from these kind of storylines if this is the kind of money that they're actually going to make. And if we put inflation on this $36.5 million opening that's predicted right now, it's about 650th. So 650th best opening ever. Pretty bad news for an X-Men film. And we can also take a look at all of the films in the X-Men franchise. This list here doesn't have any inflation on it. Number 1 film for X-Men was Deadpool, and number 2 was Deadpool number 2. And we can see the worst film until Dark Phoenix, and maybe Dark Phoenix will outperform these, we don't know yet. But the worst film so far, before Dark Phoenix, is The Wolverine with $132 million. And that had an open of $53 million, which is the worst open as well. And again, right now, Deadline's predicting a $36 million or $36.5 million opening weekend. So that is drastically lower than The Wolverine. And because the reviews are bad, there's no real reason to think that it's going to pick up after that. Okay, if the reviews were good and it had a bad opening weekend, it could pick up a bit and earn some more money. But at this very early stage, there's no real reason to think that it'll earn more money than The Wolverine in total. So we can see The Wolverine in total in the US domestic market got $132 million. There's absolutely no reason to think right now that Dark Phoenix is going to get anything like $132 million if it can only do a $36 million open compared to the $53 million open for the Wolverine. And the Wolverine wasn't that long ago. It was 5-6 years ago, so it's not a lot of extra inflation to be added into it. And so that's the kind of money that we may be looking at. Again, very, very bad news for Dark Phoenix. Again, it has an estimated budget of $200 million. Generally add another 50% onto the production budget for the marketing budget, so that's $300 million to get back, and then roughly it'll get about 50 or 60% of all of the box office proceeds actually given back to the distributor itself. So it basically needs to get somewhere around about $600 million to break even. A little bit under that, but let's just go $600 million. That's an easy number to come up with. and the Wolverine got $132 million in the US domestic market. I think the Wolverine got something like $450 million internationally, or somewhere over $400 million, and that's probably what we're looking at for Dark Phoenix, or in fact, that's probably higher than what we're looking at for Dark Phoenix. So Dark Phoenix might lose hundreds of millions of dollars. That could be perhaps what they're looking at. So again, just a catastrophic fail if this is what we're looking at. And yeah, there's no chance these characters will be reviving their role under the MCU. I imagine they'll just bring in a brush and sweep it all away, and whatever they do with the X-Men, they'll probably recast all the people and reboot it. So what can we compare the film with? What can we have a look as it opens up to see how it's actually going? We've got some films here with pretty similar opens, about the $36 million-ish range, or 33 to 38 I think I looked at. The number one film here by a long way is Jumanji: Welcome to the Jungle. I don't think there's any chance of that actually happening for Dark Phoenix, but it's something that happened before. So Jumanji has an opening that is similar to this predicted open for Dark Phoenix, and it went on to make more than $400 million in the US domestic market. So again, I don't think that'll happen, but that's kind of best case scenario here. We've also got Ocean's 13, Ted 2, Hellboy 2, and Alien Covenant, and Alien Covenant was the worst performing out of these films here, all with a very similar open. So that'll be the main one to keep an eye on. Is it going to do better than Alien Covenant or not? And this chart here I've modified slightly. I've got rid of the Jumanji film because I think it's just unrealistic to expect it to go there, but it did highlight just how much money a film could make in theory if it had a sort of similar open. And I've put the Wolverine in instead, which is the worst performing X-Men film perhaps up until now. Now, wouldn't have normally put something like the Wolverine on because the Wolverine's open weekend is just a lot better. There's no reason to think that it's going to perform like the Wolverine because it's already something like a third less than what the Wolverine's opened at. But nonetheless, there's the Wolverine there. That's the other thing to look at. Is it going to be possible for it to actually earn more money than the Wolverine earned? And again, without the Jumanji on here, the chart looks a bit more sort of respectable to read. You can actually see the differences or the gaps between some of these films. Not too much between Hellboy 2 and Alien Covenant, but again, Alien Covenant, that is the film to look for as to whether or not it is going to actually bend down and go under that, or is it actually going to be able to sustain a little bit of money and earn more money than Alien Covenant earned. And the actual figure that Alien Covenant got in the US domestic market was about $75 million. So that's where that purple line lines up with $75 million. So that's the kind of worst case scenario that I could really find with a film that has what is predicted right now to be the opening weekend for Dark Phoenix. So will Dark Phoenix be able to earn more than $75 million in the US domestic market? I would say that everywhere is still predicting that that will happen. It will earn more than $75 million. It's not going to be that catastrophic, but you can see here there's three films with a fairly similar amount there, Ted 2, Hellboy 2, and Alien Covenant, whereas Ocean 13, quite a bit of a difference in the amount of money that it earned, all of them with the exact same open or very similar opening weekend figures. And lastly here, we just look at the box office raw numbers that we have so far. So we have the numbers for Thursday, and unofficially Dark Phoenix was the number one film in the US domestic market. It had an estimated $5 million for its advanced screenings, and that compared to Aladdin's $4.7 million. So unofficially number one film right now, and I'm saying it's a catastrophic result, basically because it's a $200 million movie. So if it didn't cost $200 million, very different story. But the $5 million is estimated here for Dark Phoenix. That's probably not as good as they was hoping that it would actually be. And according to the Deadline article again, if they're looking at about $15 million for Friday, that includes this $5 million. That means they're getting about $10 million for Friday. They're probably looking at about $13 million for Saturday, and probably something like $8 million for Sunday. So that's roughly how that might actually break down. But the Sunday, that's where we'll see just how bad the actual reviews and the actual feeling of the film actually are. So the $10 million that it's estimated to get on Friday, again taking off the $5 million Thursday money, the $10 million for Friday, that's the main thing to compare it to for what the actual Sunday gets. If Sunday can also get about $10 million, that's fairly good news in that it's going to sustain the kind of money, and maybe it'll get something like Ocean's 13 got. Whereas if it gets a lot less than $10 million on Sunday, that's really bad news, and we may be looking at that kind of Alien Covenant type of box office. And on the international front, there's not really much to look at other than the Chinese numbers. It got about $15 million on Friday in China. It's got about $6 million so far for Saturday. Saturday isn't finished yet in China yet. and that brings its total to about $34 million so far in the Chinese market, which is a lot better than it'll obviously have at a similar point in time in the US market. So it's sort of good news there. I think China is actually underperforming where they hoped as well, but the Chinese numbers look better than what the US numbers will actually be, so maybe that's good news. And you can see here also in these Chinese numbers, Godzilla was number 2 in China. It got $102 million so far over there, and we got Aladdin down to number 5 now for only $46 million. So Godzilla is doing far better in China than it's doing in the US market, whereas Aladdin doing far worse in China than it's doing in the US market. And Detective Pikachu still going a little bit in China. I'm sure that'll come to an end very soon, with about $500,000 so far for Saturday. So we'll have to wait until the official numbers for Friday come out just to see how bad it is. Is it going to get only $10 million on Friday plus the $5 million for Thursday? So is it only going to have a reported $15 million for Friday? If so, catastrophe ahead. Or is it actually going to go back to this sort of $50-55 million mark, which was predicted a few days ago? Thanks for listening, and I'll catch you next time.